Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's audit meeting. For viewers at home, this is a new journey in the history of audit committees and other council committees, as we're part hybrid, part virtual. So it'll be interesting to see and hear your experiences. So welcome, everyone. Now, we do have some special guest stars tonight. We've got a lot of different people come to visit us. Now I'm going to bear with me, my eyes aren't great, so I'll say hello to all the special guest stars. So hi Mark, hi Alex, hi Nicola, hi Steve, and who else we got? Hi Vicky, the Chief, Nick, Anthony, and Jez. Welcome to you all. Some of my and John as well. Welcome, John. So some of my favourite council officers are here tonight. So I'm not sure what the collective noun is for awesomeness, but it certainly is before me. So welcome to you all. What we'll do is we'll crack on in a normal way, but what we'll try and do tonight and explain how we'll take the questions. If members in the room can indicate if they want to speak by raising their hand, and likewise if members who are virtual and also any of the officers want to speak, again, just raise your hand and we'll pick that up and then go to you in the order that the hands go up. So without further ado, we'll make a start. So agenda item 1, declarations of interest. I have a declaration of interest. I in fact have 2. So I'd like to declare a personal interest for item 5, the strategic risk register, as I'm a non-executive director of Blackpool Transport Services and Blackpool Entertainment Company Limited, and item 6, the management response to the accounts, as obviously I'm a director of Blackpool Transport. In the event of the specific companies being discussed, this will then suddenly become a prejudicial interest, and at that point I will leave the meeting. So I don't know if anyone else has any. Councillor Burdes.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to declare a personal interest in Agenda 5, the Strategic Risk Register, as a non-executive director of Blackpool Transport Services, and should BTS be discussed in detail, I would declare a prejudicial interest in if the company is discussed in depth. And again, for item 6, the management response to accounts, a personal interest, and again, should BTS be discussed in detail, I will declare a prejudicial interest.
Thank you. Councillor Critchley?
I'd like to
declare.
I'd like to declare a personal interest in item 5, the strategic register, due to changes in my employment, moving into supported living.
Okay. Who wants to go there? Yeah. Councillor Roberts.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, personal interest in agenda items 5 and 6 as non-executive director of Blackpool Airport Limited. Should we discuss the company further in any depth, this will become prejudicial interest. Prejudicial interest.
Thank you, Councillor Scott.
Personal interest in strategic risk register, item 5, as an elected member of Blackpool Teaching Hospitals Trust. If the trust is mentioned in depth, then this will be prejudicial and I shall leave.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I can't see any of no one else there. Great. Okay, agenda item 2, minutes of the last meeting held on the 29th of April. Do we take those to be a true and correct record?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Agenda item 3, the audit follow-up, the vehicle operator's licence. Now, for those who aren't aware, what we like to do in audit is to follow up on certain items that have come up before us as a committee. If they have a lot of priority 2s and priority 3s, we just like to make sure that they've been picked up, as that's an area sometimes our internal audit team don't always have time to track. So this is our safety net approach. Now, one of the things I was thinking, is it you, Jez, that's going to cover this this item? Which officer is going to cover the item? It is you, Jez. Brilliant. Oh, thank you, Jez. So what I was thinking, Jez, because it's quite a full agenda, and we've got quite a few questions for you. They're all nice questions, by the way. If we could be really mean to you and just say, if you could give us a summary of, say, 5 or 6 minutes of what progress you've made, and then that leaves us, say, 15 minutes to give you enough questions and answer time. How does that sound? Brilliant. Okay, Jez, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Chair. So the operating licence is obviously to make sure that Blackpool Council are fully compliant with its vehicle operating licence, and that's about round inspection of vehicles, driver behaviour, driver log sheets, and alike. And as a directorate, we invite Tracy and the audit team to choose services that we know have got high risk, and we'd sort of agreed with Tracy that this would have been a good area to review. I became head of service of that in July 2018, so whilst I've probably got some industry skill around it, I still wasn't clear on all matters in relation to that. So we welcome the audit inspection, and of course it did find several recommendations. And just to really set the scene as well, the actual audit and the implementation of the recommendations came at the worst time in relation to COVID, because integrated Lynn Rowbottom, the O licence manager, is also responsible for integrated transport. And integrated transport covers children's transport provision, social service transport provision, rideability, and school crossing patrols. So Lynn, as the O licence holder, also has a secondary management responsibility, which certainly from April 2020 has been absolutely immense with the COVID changes and the like. But I'm pleased to say that in relation to the recommendations from the audit report, we've made, I would like to say, appropriate progress, if not excellent progress. I think as soon as the recommendation came out that the compliance part of the report requires a transport manager to spend a certain amount of hours per week in relation to the number of vehicles on the O licence. And clearly Lynn's attention was probably distracted by the COVID and integrated transport, which without COVID is a very, very busy service with lots of changes. And you might know from other committee report areas the amount of children that are transported by our service and the changes that COVID brought about. So I think it really focused our attention on the fact that the compliance of our operator licence needed to do a certain number of hours per week. And I think it was clear for everybody to see that Lynn's ability to actually fulfil that requirement was lacking. That's not to say there wasn't provision behind Lynn. We do have, we've got another operator licence who is operator licence trained, but he's not the O licence holder. So our chief mechanic, so to speak, is also trained to that same standard. So the safety net around that was that all the things that Blackpool should be doing in relation to the transport checks and vehicle checks, the really important stuff, that was being done. It's not like there was nobody doing it, but Lynn, the manager, as the O licence holder, it was recognised that she wasn't doing the required compliant number of hours over her shared responsibilities. So, I mean, I would like to say that we've put all measures in the recommendations, we've made progress on that. I'm quite happy to go through the recommendations, although they are there, and if there's questions about that, is that the best opportunity to answer them?
Yeah, that's it. I think that's better, isn't it? We can then identify whatever we want to focus on and so on. So are you okay if we go to questions, Jez? That was a good summary. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Jez. That was really good. Do we have any questions? Councillor Hunter?
Yes, Jez. It's in respect of really 3 of the recommendations. You pending the changes what do you think the impact of that will be? That's yeah, it's recommendation one, Jez. What do you feel? What do you feel the impact will be arising out of the NBECO, as that's how it's pronounced, merger on the service? It's referred to in recommendation one. The second recommendation, really, you've probably done part of this already, but give us a summary of what has happened precisely in respect of that recommendation. But in particular, you do say that team leader post is temporarily in place. What will happen when that temporary post, say, comes to an end? What will be the position then? And finally, it's recommendation, I think it's recommendation 11. Let me see, let's bring it up now. Yes, really quite simply, it's concerning that some of those things identified in that recommendation were not being done in the first place. Have you any comments to make on that, Jez?
I think so. If I answer the first point first, recommendation one, it was a priority 3, and the organisation chart needed updating, and that's been carried out. In respect to the transfer of services and vehicles going over to NBECO, I would say that'll half the council's operators licence workload in relation to vehicles by 50%. So the bulk, in fact more than that, the bulk of the HGV operator licence vehicles will be transferring to NBECO, which I think it leaves perhaps 14 HGV vehicles and 4 HGV trailers on the operating licence with the current licence manager. On top of that, the buses for integrated transport, there's 55 of those vehicles, and they are similarly inspected and compliance up to that operator license spec. Those vehicles that go over to NBECO will get transferred into NBECO, who already operate with their own transport manager. I understand, and obviously the transition hasn't taken place, but I understand as a key player in part of the smooth transition that so they've already got their own transport operator license holder, and they will be employing a second transport manager holder to support that. So there won't be a weakness certainly going into NBECO from what I understand is being proposed, and I believe to be correct. So there will be 2 transport manager O license holders within NBECO from the 1st of September. And question 11. Well, all driving licenses are checked at CVMU, the Vehicle Maintenance Unit office. I think the issue here is that if a driver hasn't been to provide their license, then there is a delay between Lynn as transport manager notifying the service manager to get their employee to come and provide that driving license. The measures in place from a driving at work corporate strategy is to go and implement some training with service managers. As you know, service managers change, come and go. I think sometimes there's a reliance that Lynn does everything. Well, Lynn as the transport manager, she's responsible, but service managers who have drivers have got a responsibility to ensure their drivers do supply their driving license. And in fact, I think it's gone to the point where Lynn has actually told the service manager that that driver cannot take the vehicle out until he's brought his license in. So I'm fairly satisfied that the audit report has actually sort of focused attention around drivers bringing their driving license in a timely fashion.
Jez. And so I think the final question there was, as I understood it, is around this theme of there were a lot of recommendations, and I know you had identified them anyway. Why do you feel the service had got itself into that position? And it was, yeah, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, it's not an easy one to answer, but there's a lot of reliance on Lynn as the transport manager, but she does heavily rely on service managers who operate the fleets, such as myself, from a street cleansing point of view. Distant communication can create a problem, but if you look at what the priority requirements, the 2s and 3s, and I'm not belittling them, but certainly the compliance around Lynn having sufficient capacity and hours to be compliant was clearly a game changer in bringing in Adam in. I'm sorry I didn't answer the councillor's previous question on the temporary post. So the temporary post will become permanent from the 1st of September. So that will allow Lynn to still continue with the progress that's been made around the whole full compliance. So, you know, that's been in place will have been in place for 12 months at September, at which time we would have carried out the review. I can say that the review by myself and the director has been concluded, and we will look to make that post permanent in the sense that we recognise that to be compliant, it was necessary to build that team up. I think through austerity, the truth of it is there was one cut too many, and it's taken several, I wouldn't say months, but several 2 or 3 years to actually realise the impact that it has on Lynn's ability to be compliant with her operator licence, but also to manage the integrated transport service. So integrated transport will have this team leader post made permanent, and she came from the original team whose post will be backfilled.
Thank you, Jess. And I believe that you've largely covered most of the questions we were. Okay, Councillor Burgess.
Thank you, Chair. My question is just for you, beyond this, beyond the audit, of the recommendations made, which do you think have helped the most with operational efficiency? Or
For me, it's the one recognising that Lynn hasn't got wasn't fulfilling the compliance for the number of hours as for the operator's licence. So it goes in bands of from 20 vehicles, 30 vehicles, you do 20 hours, 30 hours. Lynn should have been doing 30 hours a week around her role in operator licence compliant. Had we used one of our service mechanic team leaders, who is also passed the examination to be an operator licence, had we had them on the operator licence, then if you looked at all the hours that he did in doing the compliance checks, we would have been compliant. So for me, it's a technical loss in the fact that we did have somebody supporting Lynn who was at the same educational level as Lynn, but he wasn't on our operator licence because that wasn't his job. He was a lead mechanic, but he was trained up to that academic qualification level. And of course, Lynn relies heavily, one, in his role as the chief mechanic, but two, to ensure that those compliance checks in relation to vehicle safety are all being carried out. So in answer to the question, Councillor, certainly allowing that extra time for Lynn to concentrate on vehicles rather than integrated transport has definitely been the game changer. I wouldn't say efficiency, but certainly getting practices and procedures into place in the first instance, and now it's about is actually maintaining and the inspection of the service managers who need to support her to actually do some checks with them as well as.
Sounds to me like as well, you could also look at how to, you know, beyond this, how to spread the load, because if you and train people up, because if you're saying there was actually somebody there who could do it, who just doesn't have that certification, then perhaps there's a training issue there as well that needs to be followed up.
Yeah, and you're dead right, Councillor. So the bulk of the HGV fleet, which is required on the operator licence, the bulk of that 60 odd HGVs are going over to Inveco from a fleet of maybe 130 vehicles that are transferring across. So within the council's remit, there'll only be these 14 HGVs and 4 HGV trailers, along with the buses. So I do think Lynn's workload will be halved. I've made aware to my director that there possibly does need to be somebody put through the operator licence criteria, but that's not to say that help can always be brought in. But you're right, from a business continuity, that it would be now's the right time to perhaps develop another member of staff. But I certainly think 50% of the responsibility has gone. The extra member of staff is within the team, and Lynn can manage that operator licence for Blackpool.
Councillor Roberts.
Thanks, Chair. Jez, can you hear me okay, first of all? Yeah, great. Just thinking about the priority 1 recommendation on page 18, and just following on from some of the questions that you've already had. How satisfied are you now that you've got the correct level of resource in place to make sure that the findings that we had last time in the next audit are gone? You spoke about the temporary post being made permanent, but is there anything else from a skills or a resource point of view that you feel like you need to put in place, or we need to put in place as a council?
Genuinely don't. I think the impact of COVID and the integrated transport in what was already a busy service, but the number of children that are being transported to schools, along with the COVID special measures that were put in place, along with self-isolation of classes, there was a daily planning issue in there that Lynn had to be heavily involved in. I do feel that the team leader role was the role that was just cut. You know, we cut a bit too deep. Through austerity and making savings, it was one cut too deep. And I suppose from Lynn's point of view, the number of hours on the operator licenses, it's a guide that you've got to be compliant with. But we have got a green record with the commissioner of the Transport Commissioner, so we do operate a sound fleet. And I feel that I have been supported right from the moment the audit recommendations came out, that we needed to do something about it. And I do feel I have been supported. I think Lynn feels as though she's had the support there as the operator licence holder, and we believe that the administrative post that will become addition, because the administrative post has become the team leader, so she's taken on a lot of the burden of the day-to-day running of integrated transport. Her post has been backfilled, and so I'm confident that it won't come up in an audit report again in relation to a resource issue.
Yes.
In terms of this, I just need to say that we requested this audit because we realised that it was an area that needed looking at. And as Jed said, we did have some concerns around capacity, and we did want a fresh pair of eyes to look at this, which audit have done brilliantly. And in terms of this, I think Jez and myself feel really confident going forward in terms of how this is going to work. There will be an O license holder, well, 2 on the side of Envico, O license holder on the side of the authority, with somebody being trained up. In terms of what's in here, and it's talking about structures and that, there will be some restructuring on the authority side, because that will be moving under the head of leisure, parks and catering services, which in terms of some of the operational people that we've got involved here, there is a natural synergy in relation to that. So in terms of this, we feel really confident. There's only one level 1 priority. And as Jez said, we've always had good reports back from the Transport Commissioner. So this has really helped us, and I feel confident going forward that we'll have the things in place that we need to manage this appropriately. And Lynn, on her side, and the operator on Envico side, will have the time that they need to have to put in place to manage the requirements under the legislation of the O license. Okay.
John, I don't know if you were peeking at my notes, John, because I've just written down here, you're an example of best practice, and yourself, Jess, in the sense that you proactively engaged with the audit team to recognise there's a problem, and using audit, as you know, we're very positive about what audit can do as a tool, and you've used it brilliantly. So every credit to you, John, and you, Jez, and Lynn as well. And I wanted to thank you on behalf of the Audit Committee for the way you've engaged with audit in that sense, because that's an example we can use with other services, but also to thank you then for obviously picking up on those recommendations, and it's very clear you've made great progress. So thank you to you all. Brilliant. Yeah, and if you could thank Lynn for us as well. I can imagine she's had a big workload.
Maybe but I will, and she does work hard, and I think she'll appreciate the warm comments. But thank you very much.
Jez, you're free to go and do lots of great work in Blackpool now. Okay, thanks, Jez. Okay, on to agenda item 4. We have the Central Selective Licensing Scheme update. Now, just to remind members that this is very easy. You could easily become distracted about this almost being a scrutiny type item, but it is here for us to look at more of the risk aspects and the governance side of the selective licensing scheme, and we'd requested an update around that basis. Now it's a big welcome to Alex, who's going to provide the update, and I believe the first time in front of the welcome to you. Time-wise, Alex, I was thinking again, if we take this a similar process we've just done with Jez's item, so if I could be really mean to you and say if you could give us a 5-6 minute appraisal, and then we can go to questions, if that's okay. So the floor is yours, Alex. Yes, we can. Yeah.
Area. This covers Brunswick, Tab and part of Bloomfield. It's the 4th selective licensing area that we've got in Blackpool. Our first one was in South Beach in 2012, followed by Claremont in 2014, and then an additional licensing scheme in Central, which covers the same area, in 2016, and that covers the HMOs. So it's our biggest selective licensing scheme. We did have to apply to the Secretary of State to get permission to introduce this selective licensing scheme because we already had other selective licensing schemes in place. So we had to go through procedure and get special permission, which we were successful in. The scheme started in 2019 and will cease to have effect in 2024. So to date, we have actually licensed all the properties, and we've taken 10 cases through, 11 cases actually, for prosecution that have failed to license. Part of the licensing scheme, which was an incentive to landlords and to improve property conditions, was the introduction of the Blackpool Standard. Now, this is the first time we've done this in Blackpool, and this allowed for a 30% reduction in the selective licensing fee. And as a result, a landlord has to make sure that he's got properly management in place. He's got to have all the documentation regarding antisocial behaviour plan. He's got to have all the certification around gas and safety, fire, electrical. He's also got to have his property up to decent space standards, because what we want to do in Blackpool is try and encourage larger properties, bedroom space particularly. So again, this is an incentive around that. Because of the COVID pandemic, we were due to actually start a proactive inspection to go around to all these properties, which gives us an opportunity to get through the front door, ensure that the landlords are fully compliant, and then take action if we find that they haven't got the Blackpool standard in place. We are looking at starting that at the end of June, July. We have actually met to look at a procedure so that we can take this forward. We found that over the pandemic period, landlords had difficulties trying to get contractors to do work. So, for instance, the energy performance certificates, they weren't able to get those updated because they were saying that they couldn't get contractors going into the properties. But what's happened during the COVID as well is that we've carried on with our enforcement. We've carried on with our reactive inspections going into properties, and overall we've actually done more enforcement this last 12 months, particularly when it comes to enforcement notices, which are chargeable, and done a lot of multi-agency work regarding antisocial behaviour. Particularly around the central area, we've recently found some quite big drug cultivations. In June, we had the one on Adelaide Street, 88 Adelaide, a hotel, 4 floors, 30 bedrooms full of cannabis plants. The street value is 1 million. And last Friday, we actually found another one at Brunswick, the Brunswick Centre, and on Kent Road, and again that was over £1 million. So the team have been carrying on doing the housing enforcement activities, but we've also been doing COVID work. But I think the real plus about licensing schemes is the multi-agency approach. We work with the police, we have an antisocial behaviour officer who's actually funded via the scheme, and working with the community safety. All public protection teams are involved, environmental protection, planning, ourselves, food, health and safety, trading standards. We work also with housing options, social services. We work very closely with Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service and the police as well. So overall, you know, we have progressed with the scheme in getting the licensing in, and definitely over the next 6 to 12 months, we'll progress further with the Blackpool standard. Okay.
That was an excellent summary. A big project squeezed into 5 minutes. You did very well. Do we have any questions for Alex? Councillor Critchley?
Hello, Alex. Nice to meet you. My question, I suppose, is just do you think the scheme offers value for money for landlords? And just all the enforcements you've made in the last 12 months, does that not then say that something not quite working or something not in place with the selective licence if you're doing all these enforcements? Because the licence is there to enforce them, to keep up their properties, isn't it?
Okay. Well, selective licensing is an actually additional tool to our housing enforcement tools that we've already got. So we have tools that we can look at disrepairing a property, but what selective licensing gives us that isn't under our normal duties, it gives us special tools to deal with antisocial behaviour and the management of properties. And that's what's key about selective licensing schemes. We want to improve them physically, we want to make sure that they're up to standard, but we want to make sure that they're managed effectively and that landlords are accountable. And over the years with the schemes from 2012, I can say with great certainty that landlords now know that they are accountable for the behaviour of the tenants. They didn't accept it at the beginning, but they do now. And, that is a real positive. Regarding value for money for the landlords, that's a big question that they always say, what are we getting from paying this money? We're paying all this money, £1,000 for a 5-year scheme. What are we getting? Well, attached to the licensing scheme is an antisocial behaviour officer. And that role is specifically about engaging with landlords, taking enforcement action if necessary, but also dealing with problematic tenants. Now, we do get a lot of cases where the tenants do cause massive amounts of money to landlords, disrepair, antisocial behaviour. So this has been really key in working proactively with landlords to deal with the issues around tenants, because we have a lot of transients in Blackpool. The other additional value that landlords have got is by improving the area, by improving the management, it means that the majority of landlords in Blackpool are very good, but we do have some very poor landlords as well. And I think the fact that they see us targeting the poor landlords actually makes them feel, I think they feel more, happier about the schemes, because they know that we're doing something very proactive about those poor properties. And ultimately, what we want to create is more sustainable communities where people are attracted to go into those areas and want to remain there and be part of the community. And ultimately, it helps them with their property values. If it's more attractive, then their property values, the capital value, will increase. The other thing that we are providing as well is subsidised training for landlords via the Landlords Forum, and Strategic Housing are really involved in that aspect, in looking at the training and encouraging landlords to be more hands-on and more knowledgeable and accountable about their role. Also, there's a lot of work around fuel poverty, the Green Homes Grant. So when we looked at our first scheme, South Beach, we did analysis of fuel poverty, and there was about 700 properties that were in fuel poverty, and that's an incredible amount of people who are suffering because of that. So the Green Homes Grant is there to help landlords particularly, and there's some new funding coming around energy performance certificates. So we will try to work with landlords to encourage them to look at renewable energy and more economical and efficient heating systems for their tenants.
So my last question, because you've talked a lot there and given lots of information, is just what does the future look like for selective licensing in Blackpool?
Sorry, I couldn't catch that question.
Sorry, just asking what the future looks like for selective licensing going forward in Blackpool. Where do you see it rolled out all areas, or? Oh,
right. Well, I think for the future, this scheme operates until 2024. I think, there will be sort of, we will be looking at, feasibility study around future licensing schemes. But at this stage, we are operating as we are with this central licensing scheme. There's a lot of work going on around improving properties as well. We've got the Blackpool Housing Company, BCH and Lumen, so that's another registered provider which is buying up poor properties. So there's a lot of other things going on. We've also done some work with central government, trying to link housing benefits and property conditions, which would be super to do that, but we weren't able to proceed with that because of legislative issues. But work continues with the strategic housing partners and central government in looking at where we go in the future with regulation of the private rented sector.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any more questions, Councillor Scott?
Yes.
Hi.
My question's twofold, really. I'll start with stat compliance, and obviously with it being quite a big estate that and the amount of properties, do you propose to set up a database with all this information, with stat compliance, fire certification, fire doors, asbestos register, Legionella, just emergency lighting? And are these are they going to be held in a logbook on each property, because there'll have to be weekly checks on Legionnaires, seldomly used taps, etc., etc. So is that going to be, like I say, held in a central register with a flag system, whereby if that fire certificate is coming out of date, fire alarm certificate is coming out of date on a certain property, that will ring a red alarm bell, and then everybody, especially elected members in that locality, will know that property is not safe.
Yes.
And when you say do checks, are they unannounced checks when you come down? To see that, I know they can produce a fire certificate, but are they? So I'll just take a fire certification for one. But are they conforming to that fire certificate, i.e., weekly fire alarm checks, fire door checks, etc., etc.? And the second part, before you answer that, is is there evidence that the scheme, where it's operating, is reducing antisocial behaviour? So it's twofold.
Sorry, I missed that second part.
Sorry, is where the scheme is operating, has it led to a reduction in antisocial behaviour?
Right. Shall I answer that one first? Yes. Well, the current scheme, no. The statistics on antisocial behaviour provided by the police actually show an increase, but that is mainly because of people calling the police, reporting to the police antisocial behaviour on COVID issues. But what's happened over the scheme, initially there will be an increase of ASB complaints to the police, and as people get more confident in reporting about that, we found in South Beach over the 5 years, because the scheme lasts for 5 years, at the end of the scheme there was a reduction of antisocial behaviour. In Claremont, which was our best result, after 5 years there was a reduction of antisocial behaviour of 43%. So we've used police data on antisocial behaviour, which we've looked at the area and the private rented, and that is specific to the rental area in Claremont. So that would showed a decrease of antisocial behaviour. As we're quite sort of early in the scheme, and because of COVID, the figures in this case aren't reliable to show, which way we're going, because there has been an increase in ASB reports because of the COVID. People, complain about COVID issues with the neighbours and that. So I think our ASB data for Central will be known probably in a few years' time. Is that okay for that question? Right. For the other question about fire safety certification and all the certification, when we look at the Blackpool standard, we will be going round and we will want full documentation, which we do. And also as part of the licence conditions, we need gas safety annual certification. We need, particularly with electrical installation certificates, we need now, and there's been new regulations come in. So again, there needs to be reports that landlords provide to us. Also with fire risk assessment, they need to be doing that on a weekly basis, and we need to see that, the records. When we go to the property, we do unannounced visits, and we also do announced visits as well. Sometimes we have to give the landlord 24 hours notice, because if we're serving an enforcement notice, it won't be valid unless we've done that. However, in Blackpool, we do a lot of unannounced visits because it's the best way really to, get in the property and see what's what. But yes, I mean, regarding certification, I think you asked about whether there's a public register about. Well, we have a property database which has every property record, every address, and attached to that property database we have issues of the license, any notices, any breaches, any prosecutions, any certification that we've got. So it's all kept on our records so that we have that information at hand, and we do keep a clear system of if there's any breaches that come in or any visits, further visits. So everything is date ordered.
You know, it comes up with a warning like that license, you know, say if you give them, if you visit a premises, if you do it in conjunction with a fire brigade, and they, you know, they notice a few things out of place, or you do on your checks, do you give them a certain amount of time to get them?
Yes, yeah, and we do return visits. If we serve an enforcement notice, then we'll go back. It's a statutory provision, so we will go back. We'll give them, say, 28 days to do the work, and then we'll do a return visit. And in the event we go back and work isn't done, then the next stage is we can actually go to prosecution for non-compliance, which we do. If a property is so bad where it's dangerous, then we'll go straight to prosecution for breaches of management regs. You know, there's lack of fire safety. We go in a property and we find that the fire alarm's in default, there's no proper fire separation, the tenants are at risk. We will take an enforcement notice, and then we will proceed to take the landlord to court. And we have done that recently, and we did get a fine of £24,000, and that was a major landlord in Blackpool. So we will go through that avenue.
When you do, say, when they're doing the weekly fire alarm checks, you know, they don't just do the same call point every week. So that's in the office. So I'll just do that one. You know, do they check on a basis of smoke detectors in each bedroom, etc., etc.?
Yeah, they've got to do a full weekly check. They've got to check, you know, that everything is in order right through the property, because if we're looking at a house in multiple occupation in Blackpool, we've got a lot more of these. You know, they are higher risk properties, and therefore, you know, the fire safety is a massive issue, and the fire risk assessment is a big part of that. We do work very closely with the fire brigade because we have a joint working protocol with them. So we have responsibilities. They have responsibilities for the common parts, the communal areas. We have responsibility for the residential. We've just been to a property today where we both served prohibition orders on the property because it's mixed residential commercial. So we work hand in hand regarding that.
To hear, and are
yeah,
you pushing?
very much.
Are you pushing for like for them to keep a specific file on site, so that when anybody's visiting, like yourselves or any councillors, they can go and ask for that file? Yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a specific file with all the documentation in, so
That's
they're not
right,
scrabbling about. You know,
yes.
Oh, it's in the biscuit tin in the.
Yeah, and the Blackpool standard is that we want all the documentation in one place. We want to show that they've got a proper antisocial behaviour plan. They've got all the gas safety, electrical, fire risk assessments, everything within that. So it's there, and also it's accessible for the tenants of the property. I think that, yeah, I think when we start our visits, I think that might be quite that might be quite a big challenge.
You've got that, you know, that's the hardest part. But thank you anyway.
Okay, pleasure.
Excellent. I'm conscious of time, and we don't
Sorry
have too
about
much.
that,
So I'll do. No. It's
digressed a bit.
very, very valid, Scott. Do we have any further questions at all? Very briefly, Alex. We just briefly mentioned the future there. Are there any future controls that you feel are necessary for the scheme in the next few years, or future controls once this scheme expires that you would like to see in the future scheme that aren't there currently?
I think in Blackpool, I think because we've had a number of schemes and we are very proactive when it comes to enforcement. We utilise all the tools that are available to us under our provisions under the Housing Act, under the antisocial behaviour legislation. And I do feel now, as I said previously, that landlords, the message is getting through. You know, they know that we will go through the process of enforcement right through to prosecution, and we will take, you know, action all the way through. I think there's been so many positive other proactive issues happening, particularly the Blackpool Housing Company and Blackpool Coastal Housing buying up poor property and renovating those and putting in proper support. I think that is a really, really good provision that is really beneficial to Blackpool.
So that was an excellent update. In the same spirit as we mentioned previously to Jez in his report, thank you to you and your team for all the work you're doing on the ground, the committee, and I know all the elected members really appreciate it. In terms of how you can use audit, if ever you do feel there is a block or a problem that you feel is systematic or structural, then in the same way that we heard earlier, a team went to Audit in terms of Tracy's team, by all means reach out to them or even the committee in any way to identify that problem in terms of ways that we can look at solutions to address and to support you. But on behalf of the committee, a huge thank you for your time tonight and all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Okay. So moving on to agenda item 5, the Strategic Risk Register, sustainability of the council. We've got quite a few different items on this. So what I propose that we do is we'll break them down into, I have a look at what we've got. So we've got sustainability of the council, so sub-risk 1A, which is going to be Steve. We'll go to adults, which is Chief's going to cover, then children's, which obviously Vicky's going to cover, and then the council-owned companies, and then we have climate change, which I believe Anthony's going to cover. So we'll break those down into 3, 4, 5 different parts. We've got time-wise, it's 6:50. So we'll try and do these in 50 minutes, which is going to be tough, but that should roughly take us to 7:40, and that should then give us time for the final item. So, Steve, a bit of a tall ask, not much time to discuss something that's huge, but if you could spare us a few minutes to provide us an update on sub-risk 1A, which is insufficient funding to deliver services, if you could.
Okay. Excellent. So yeah, the first sub-risk, insufficient funding to deliver services. I think you'd have to say that's a given. After 11 years of funding cuts, £186 million over that period, we've been through quite a journey. We've had to reprioritise our services with a focus on the statutory services. And of course, you'll recall from the budget that 79% of our budget goes into social care, adults and children's. We've had to reallocate resources, and in some cases we've made mistakes. We've gone too far, as Jez indicated earlier. We've had to put resources back because there've been unintended consequences in some quarters. We've had to undertake transformation. Some of that has been planned, some of that's been consequential. One of the consequences of COVID is natural channel shift, which has created natural efficiencies for the council, which no doubt we will continue to take forward. And over that 11-year period, we've even stopped certain services that weren't deemed a priority within the suite of services that we've provided. So 11 years down the line, it's been absolutely critical that with the resource that we have that we monitor it very, very carefully. And certainly from the last few years, we've been providing monitoring information from day one. From April the 1st, we've been able to produce a financial outturn across our services and indeed companies. And obviously under the current position, monitoring the impact of the pandemic. As you recall, last year, the early points of the year, we were looking at ranges of exposure of risk in the region of 20 to 30 million. Well, the last submission that we made to the MHCLG was 3.16 million. And that monitoring has continued into the current year. And the first period, we showed a net pressure for the year of 1.73 million. And I think another positive of the pandemic has actually been the continuing dialogue with central government departments, in particular MHCLG, because for them it's been a learning curve themselves. And whilst at the outset they promised to honour refunding local authority spend associated with the pandemic, there has been a time delay in certain quarters while central government actually understood the consequences. But I think maintaining that dialogue, and it continues to be maintained, has paid dividends. And again, if you look at the outturn report that I presented to Executive on Monday, you'll see that Blackpool Council received some 166 million of central government funding across its services, across its businesses, in terms of business support grants, business rate reliefs, across its companies, light rail grants to Blackpool Transport Services. I'm sure none of this would have happened unless we'd maintained that dialogue with central government, which has been absolutely critical. Obviously, having a medium-term financial strategy and plan is key. The current strategy lapses in 21-22. I still believe that the principles, objectives, priorities within that still hold. Obviously, the numbers will differ. There are two sides to looking at allocation of resources. One is to understand the expenditure resource needed to maintain and deliver services. And the other side of the equation is what level of funding do you deem available? Well, we're very good at modelling expenditure against our services, against prospective demand. What we're less certain of is central government funding. And we've indicated on here there are a number of initiatives such as fair funding review, business rates, etc., that the government have promised to review, undertake, and reallocate resource, and have delayed these for some 2-3 years. So trying to preempt the outcome of that is very difficult. But I've always worked on the basis it's always best to have a good plan now rather than a perfect plan tomorrow. And we will be refreshing that strategy during the summer recess. And the only reason we're doing it during the summer recess is because that is our less busy time of the year, when we've got the budget out of the way, when we've got hopefully closed down and final accounts out of the way. Links in with that medium-term financial strategy is also an update of our various income and debt collection strategies, fair debt policy. It's quite apparent in the last 12 months that income has been a risk to the council and income collected within the locality. So that will be updated and will dovetail within that strategy. We've also received recommendations over the last 2 years from our external auditor, and it's also been apparent that other risks have emerged, in particular the exposure to our wholly owned companies, particularly during the pandemic. So following the retirement of the chief accountant at the end of May, I've looked to restructure the whole finance section and provide some refocusing of where those greater risks are emerging. And we only got clearance yesterday from the union, the consultation with them, so we'll be progressing that over the next week or two's time. And I mentioned external audit, and they too have a place in managing this risk. And clearly know that our new external auditors, Deloitte, who've been with us a couple of years now, provide a very robust service and a value-adding service in terms of highlighting what we should be looking at. So, and further, as a consequence of that, you'll be familiar with the Redmond review that reported back a couple of months ago. And within that review, the government have allocated £15 million to local government. And my estimate of that share for Blackpool would probably be in the region of £40,000 to £60,000. And again, that will be very welcome to prop up the financial support areas. One of the, despite funding cuts,
Steve, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry, I'm just conscious we've only got an hour left of the meeting. We've got such a big agenda. Apologies, Steve. So it's just to sum up for us.
I would just say that despite sort of shrinking of funding in some areas, one of the growth areas has been around capital. And we've had the town deal fund, we've got community renewal fund, we're bidding for levelling up funding, and we must use that to actually recreate some back office infrastructure to ensure that they are delivered successfully. So perhaps, if I do wrap up then, I would say under this particular category, it's probably worth looking at the response within the ISA 260 report, which is the next item on the agenda, and the management response to financial sustainability, because I think we've outlined there in some detail what we're actually doing about it to evidence that we are solvent and will continue to be.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve, and apologies for interrupting. I really appreciate that. Do we have any questions for Steve at all?
There was one. Steve has answered it anyway. But, the current ratio of spending, 79%, 21% children's and adult social care. Is that sustainable?
When you look at the national average of about 60%, no, we are an extreme outlier, and we need to review that. And certainly, Ms. Smith and Ms. Gent are looking at those areas to, I suppose, to right size. We will always be on the high side, being one of the most deprived local authorities in the country, having very elderly population, but yeah, a more realistic level.
Thanks, Steve.
Just to come back on that, Steve, what would you say very quickly the right number or ratio would look like?
I wouldn't give you a figure now on that. I think we have to work towards something, and in children's and adults, they both have a 5-year medium-term financial strategy and plan, and I think that's what we've got to work towards. Excellent. It's a longer-term objective.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'll just bring in Councillor Hunter.
Yes, it seems to have disappeared off the screen at the moment, Steve, but I'm sure he's still there. Yeah, there is reference here in the report before the committee that the wholly owned companies, of which we have several, remain sustainable. Could I ask firstly, has that taken risks into account that are which are there as a result of potential loss of control? He's still there, is he? I'm not talking to myself and the people in this room. Yeah. Has that sort of assertion taken into account the possibility of further lockdown restrictions, which we could be faced with? But secondly, I appreciate that all the wholly owned companies are limited and that limited liability, but I am curious to know as to what really the overall.
Councillor Hunter, that's an item to come on the risk register. That question.
Sorry.
That's an item to come.
It's to come under the risk register.
It is, but that's at 1C, that section.
Okay, fair enough.
So you can just concentrate on the first question for now.
Yeah. Okay, Steve. Sorry about that, Chair. Yes.
Steve, would you like to answer the first question?
Shall I repeat the first question?
No, not that one, Steve. No, the first question.
No, the first question, Steve, was that have the risks that further lockdown controls might pose taken into account in that particular assertion that the wholly owned companies remain sustainable?
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Hunter, you're on the wrong section. This is one A is sustainability of the council. That's sustainability of the company.
Right, sorry.
Okay, it's all right. You can come back and ask them when we get to 1C. Yeah. Do we have any questions on for Steve at all on this part? Okay. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Sorry. Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. You're currently very dark figure there. I can barely see you. Brilliant. Apologies, Councillor Mitchell.
Question to Mr. Thompson. he referred to restructuring of staff, and I think that's quite important. I think he would acknowledge the need to build fresh capacity in analysing council services and trying to achieve more with less. I'm interested, possibly he could give us a sneak preview of his thinking. Is he planning to employ more staff, or how else would he bring in that extra capacity? I wonder if you could give us a sneak preview of that.
I think in short, it's a redistribution of workload and a reprioritisation. So, you know, a refocus on the key areas, and in some other areas, we take a sort of risk management approach. You know, we've worked very closely in the past with individual services. I think we sometimes have to perhaps cut that umbilical cord in places and place reliance on providing the training and development to the services to manage themselves to some extent, whilst, you know, we have to deal with the higher priority outcomes.
Okay, so are you planning to advertise and bring in new talent, or just making more of the talent that you already have?
We have some excellent talent, and I think it's a great opportunity to bring that talent on.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? We'll go on to 1B, which is the sub-risk insufficient central government funding for social care. Chief, I believe you're going to cover for very, very mean to you again. I do this to you every audit meeting at the moment. If you could be brief as you possibly could, and apologies.
You've already got a bit of a summary of the actions taking place within adult services on your page 34, which gives you an idea of the work that takes place in terms of understanding the costs and sharing that information with the LGA and also across Lancashire to make sure the DHSC is well aware of what the costs are, what the pressures are. I think some additional things that are in place within Blackpool, and just to refer back to the questions that you just had about the sort of proportion of spend in Blackpool that is both adult and children's social care. In adult social care, we have a higher proportion of people who cannot afford to contribute towards their own care than in many areas. So you will see a higher level of spend on adult social care due to that both need in terms of people's frailty and any health conditions, but also they're less likely to pay a significant amount towards their care, so make it more expensive. So one of the other elements as well, which also is very useful for us in terms of managing the budget, but again, it makes it a very different picture than elsewhere in the country, is we do receive quite a bit of joint funding alongside our health colleagues, and we're also quite successful on all our services, so the 20% of services, about bringing in additional funding, and in particular if you look at housing, quite a bit of additional funding comes in that area, which in other areas may well be core funding. So that additional income we bring in does somewhat distort our position when you look at the non-care elements of our budget, and that would fit in with our tourism side as well, in terms of car parking income and in terms of the spend we have on like the illuminations and such. But to come just back to adult social care specifically, the medium-term financial plan that's in place in adult social care over that 5-year period is worked on a consistent and regular basis by Steve's team and by Karen's team to really understand what the cost drivers are. So they have a detailed understanding which projects out over a number of years around what the demands are and what they're expected to be. So that will be looking at population levels, it'll be projecting out age ranges. It will also be using the knowledge they have about the increasing of age of children who might move into adult disability services, but also the need that they understand within their own services. So there's plenty of intelligence within that, which leads them to have a very good understanding of cost drivers. And on top of that, those regular meetings that they have between the finance and the adult social care teams, because they are very much on top of it. If you look at the spending levels compared to budget over the last few years in adult social care, it compares extremely favourably with other areas in terms of matching their budget and managing within their resources. One of the other reasons why it's absolutely vital that they have those medium-term financial plans is, particularly when you're working with health services, there's funding that's available which isn't always available in the long term. So we work around what we can bring in to support some of our services, the ARC being a good example of funding which we agree with health, but isn't necessarily going to be there forever. So projecting out funding that you know, as well as projecting out demand as well, is absolutely critical, as well as managing contracts, as well as managing the commissioning of placements and fees as well. One thing is absolutely worth referencing here in terms of costs and managing costs. The cost increases that have been in place during COVID have been significant. That includes PPE, that includes the extra 10% we pay to all residential care providers, as well as infection prevention measures and testing measures. We did receive substantial amounts of money via the government's grants, both in terms of testing, the infection prevention fund, and additional monies that came through the NHS. A lot of that money ends at the end of June. So there's an uncertainty in the system nationally about what happens post-COVID funding. Now, in a lot of areas, the COVID funding legitimately ends at the end of June because the intention is that the world starts to open up in a significant way. But costs will not suddenly disappear from the adult social care market, particularly in residential care. So that uncertainty is a concern, but obviously that's been raised at directly with DHSC and Public Health England, but also with through the LGA. We're also awaiting further information about the white paper and what that means for the long-term funding, both for individuals and for local authorities for adult social care as well. So an element of uncertainty there. So working with our colleagues in other authorities is absolutely vital to make sure that information is provided through to the relevant decision makers nationally. It is our single largest budget, and that's the reason why we devote a lot of time, and to be honest, Steve puts some of his best people on it as well to make sure that we do have that information. So I think that just gives you a broad overview about why we think it's absolutely vital, why we focus on doing the right thing but keep a really good cost controls, and we project out into the longer term. Even during this sort of crazy 18 months, they've been very much on top of the costs. Just this uncertainty around what happens post-June with funding. There will need to be a national answer to that.
Thank you, Chief. That was an excellent summary. Do we have any questions for the Chief at all? Stuart, do you want to come in at all?
Thank you to Neil and indeed Steve for the comments there. Yeah, my question, I suppose, relates to both adult and children's social care. It's about value for money. Given the huge, substantial, undoubtedly pressures created by providing both of these services, how able are we to get assurance or give effect to securing value for money, given the nature of these two markets? I like what I've heard about financial modelling, the understanding of the cost drivers, partnerships with colleagues in health services and so on. What else can Blackpool do, perhaps, to get value for money, given the nature of adult and social care as markets?
I'll start with the adult social care market. The adult social care market in Blackpool is probably less difficult than in other areas. That'll be because, particularly in the residential care market, there is quite a bit of provision because of the nature of the accommodation that we have. So there's more providers, including providing to out of borough. But the biggest pressure there is in a more specialist services and nursing care and care for people with dementia. So that is a really complex market and is the more expensive one. So we manage that in a very detailed way, but also a lot of engagement with the providers. So we don't take a view of managing a market the way you might procure a lot of services. So when you talk about value for money, it's not necessarily about doing a sort of tender evaluation in the same sort of way. Certainly for residential care, a lot of that comes down to the regular monitoring that comes from our commissioning team, who regularly meet up and visit our care providers, and they are quality assurance people. So we have quality monitoring officers who regularly attend, meet and discuss the delivery of service with providers. So we have some very bespoke services, particularly when you're looking at things like dementia, but more so with adults with other disabilities under 65, physical disabilities, learning disabilities, or mental health. So it's very much case by case. And we don't take a draconian view in terms of improvement. If there are issues to improve, but we have a provider who has the right approach, we will work with them to try and help them improve and be realistic about what those services cost. So we do work with individual providers to look at what their cost drivers are, talk to them about the ways they may be able to make some efficiencies within it, but also being realistic about what the care package needs to be for the individual, because getting the right outcomes is where value for money comes, rather than necessarily purely being about the cost of the individual home or the cost of the individual care at home provider either. So, I mean, we could probably find a lot more detail in terms of what the quality monitoring officers and the quality monitoring team do to ensure that we do that. During the pandemic, we speak with every single residential and nursing home provider every day, certainly making sure they had enough PPE, that they had the staff in place and everything else. So that relationship pays dividends. And we have a good understanding of the weaker providers, and they have obviously the ones who have struggled a little bit more during the pandemic, but they get more extensive monitoring to ensure they provide a quality service. So it's not always easy to tell whether it's a big provider or a small provider would be best. It can depend on the nature of the care they give, but also the way they're structured, the buildings they have, and the approach they have. We have some very, very, very good providers. Just to jump into children's social care a little bit, we also take the same quality monitoring approach there, but it's a much more difficult market. You may have read in the press over the last week that that's a market that has a really small amount of availability. So the providers have the whip hand because the demand is greater than the supply, and it's very complex. So that is a much more complex period, which is the reason why there's been the national investigations into it and the national views around it. And we're trying to make sure we can control some of the quality of that within Blackpool using a variety of tools, including planning, to make sure that we keep the best there are, and we use it for our own children who need that level of support. I mean, Vicky will be able to talk about it in some more detail, and also about her approach when she's been working at the county before she came to join us in lovely sunny Blackpool. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stuart. Do we have any further questions at all? Councillor Burdest, do you want to come in?
Yes, Chair, thank you. You mentioned about that the cost of care will not automatically or magically disappear, and also kind of alluded to the recommendations of the white paper and the long-term funding. So I'm wondering how and if we're reviewing future demographic trends to consider perhaps the use of investor save schemes, and what impact they would have in terms of our ability to respond to the needs of these sectors.
When it comes to managing the market within adult social care, then working with our providers is a big part of how we make sure that we are investing in the right areas so that they can deliver quality services. We have also increased the size of our own in-house provision. So we don't operate residential care, we do operate the Assessment Rehabilitation Centre, which is intermediate care, to try and make sure that people can be kept at home as long as possible, and that we can discharge people from hospital as quickly as possible as well. In the in-house provision we have, it is largely for care at home and for more complex individuals. So where we have more complex needs, then we are able to put bespoke packages together ourselves for those people. So we've had some particularly complex cases where adults with learning disabilities have been discharged from long-term health provision. So bespoking that is very much of that investing to save, not so much just purely looking at the pound notes, but also looking at the better outcomes and the best environment for each individual. So it's more an investment in service provision than it would be in, say, a physical thing. But we're looking at, on the children's side, the medium-term financial plan that's been mentioned was actually a big investment in services within children's social care, which was approved at the executive, which included an investment in legal specialisms, included therapeutic interventions. It included expert foster care provision as well. So to try and make sure we have the kind of service provision which is more local, which is more bespoke, which is actually trying to reduce the number of children who would need specialist residential care and build them towards their successful adulthood, if you will. That is what we would see as being the long-term best thing for everybody. It's true, it's cheaper in the long term, but also it's the right thing. It's the best outcome for those young people. So if you look at the plans that were in place from that medium-term financial plan investment that we had in children's social care, very much a trajectory of spending more over the first 2 years, it breaking even in year 3, and then in years 4 and 5, it would actually cost less money, have less children in care, and have better outcomes for all those young people as well.
I'm kind of thinking as well with the specialist residential care, is it uniform? Are we being charged the same by everybody for the same things? Is that something that could be looked into, that consistency of service, that offer?
I'll let Vicky chime into this, but essentially in areas where there's very complex needs, then the providers can end up charging very different rates in different parts of the country based on demand. I think you may have seen a report which showed that some of the bigger providers of specialist residential care in the children's market are making hundreds of millions of pounds a year profit. So that is where the market has greater control than the local authorities. So there has been quite a bit of joint work across local authorities to try and rebalance things and make sure we get the best quality of care possible. But I'll let Vicky add a little bit to that.
Yeah.
To your first audit committee.
Thank you.
Again, sorry to this to you, we're short on time.
Yeah.
Handing your summary in. The floor is yours.
Right, I'll try and keep it really succinct. I'd just like to initially pick up on and just follow through from some of the points that Mr. Jacks raised. So, as Mr. Jacks says, you know, the residential market is extremely complex. You know, the challenges that Blackpool face are not unique. And I suppose, you know, what you will see is the increasing complexity of children's needs equates to the increasing cost. And we do have a lot of complex children and young people within Blackpool. So, you know, it's certainly not by any means unique. So I'd just perhaps like to just quickly take a step back too, just to start off really and say, for children's services, as you've heard Mr. Thompson say, we do have some pressures across 2021-22, and as we know, they are within that placements budget, and in particular around residential care, which we've already said, and independent placements. So, you know, that is my starting point here. Now, in terms of controls to manage those risks, again, probably going to repeat a little bit really in terms of what Mr. Jacks already said. We also have that medium-term financial project in place. We have a board which meets monthly. I've actually had an opportunity since I've been in Blackpool to really get stuck into the nitty-gritties of that. And like adult services, we also have some really detailed performance data, information, really nuanced look at what's going on within children's services and what are those pressure points. So whether it's in terms of new entrants into care, the ages of children, etc., we've got a lot of detailed data to hand. So we are monitoring that monthly, you know, and there are some good news stories there as well. The numbers of new entrants into care are coming down for Blackpool. But as you can see in the risk register, we do have quite a significant cohort of children that are quite difficult to move out of residential care for a whole complexity of reasons. We also have monthly meetings in place with the Chief Officer for Finance, Mr. Thompson, and his accountancy colleagues as well. And there are monthly reviews of our children and young people in those very high cost placements. I just also want to pick up, and I know it was touched on before, the independent review of children's social care. I mean, this is an absolutely enormous piece of work. You know, since I've worked for children's social care, I haven't seen anything like it before. It was announced back in March, And actually we're due initial, not the full report, we're due an initial report, I believe this next week. And some of the issues that report will start to look at, well, it will look at the residential care market. It will look at the challenges that local authorities have around that. And we've already touched on good value and actually achieving the right thing and good outcomes for our children and young people. But it will also address some very fundamental issues. And I don't want to get philosophical in this, but it will be about fundamentally also the purpose and the use of the care system as well. So it's really going to take some of those issues back to the core. And in terms of our role in Blackpool in that, I can tell you that on the 5th of July, there is a national event that really focuses in on the challenges for the Northwest. We have places for that for Blackpool. I'm attending that on the 5th of July, and that's a Northwest engagement event. So we can really contribute to that debate around that independent review of children's social care. So that is really now getting off the ground as well. So I'll just pause there for a minute. I've made that quite swift. So is that
They
okay?
call that a successful parachute jump, Vicky. You did brilliant. Well done. Well done.
I think Mr. Jack did some of the work there for me, actually.
Brilliant. Do we have any questions for Vicky? Councillor Scott?
Are you confident, or how confident are you that you can deliver the medium-term financial plan for children's services in conjunction with handling the overspend?
I am only 8 weeks into the job, but what I can say is this: there are some real green shoots in there. You know, I won't dispute there are challenges in there as well. As I say, some of the positives are that we are starting to see that number of new entrants come down. Now, the reason that's important is that's telling me that our practice is starting to change, and that across children's services and into our partnership, we're perhaps building confidence around how we manage children and young people and think about their outcomes. It is a 5-year strategy, as Mr. Jack's referred to already, you know, and we're quite, you know, new into that. So, you know, I'm very new here. I can only say at this stage I remain optimistic that over a number of years, that as we start to see that number of children in care come down and we start to get traction on the number of children going out, over a longer period of time, we will start to see progress.
Thank you. Further questions at all? Councillor Burdess?
I was thinking, just looking at the economics of it, really, it's like when you're looking at residential care, if the numbers, we can't really influence that all that well. So it's, I wonder what we could do to look at the control we have over where they're receiving what we're paying for. I don't know. Is there
I'm sorry,
way?
I just didn't hear that last bit. Then I'm sorry.
Yeah,
could you just repeat that last bit?
It's what work can be done to assess whether our young people, our children are receiving what we're paying for in private residential care.
So it's a value for money question, Vicky. Yeah, are we getting the best value for money? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have to remember that in residential care, you know, like children's services, we do have a regulator. We have that in Ofsted. You know, all children's homes are regulated by Ofsted, whether they're, you know, provided by us or provided externally. All those services are regulated by Ofsted. I think it's a really difficult question to answer, particularly when my starting point, as Mr. Jack has already said, is we don't really want children in residential care. It's not really a good outcome for them. So in terms of good value for money, you know, I don't think I can confidently say that, you know, while those children and young people may be safe, you know, they may be, you know, delivering to a certain framework. Is it ideally what we want? No, not particularly. I don't know if I can answer that question any further, really. You know, we've already said it is quite a fragile market, and sometimes it's quite difficult to match children to the placements that we actually want them to be in, because we're very much at the mercy of what's actually on offer for us.
Can't match them, that's where potentially overspending happens.
It's not just overspending, it's unfortunately sometimes children are in placements that we don't ideally want them to be in, and that's because of the complexity of their needs. So really our main driver has to be to get children into fostering placements and into family homes. Now we have to recognise that some children aren't able to function within family homes and it's not the right thing for them, but really their best outcomes are sourced within the fostering market. And as Mr. Jack said, that's not just because financially that's better, it's actually a better outcome for them. So residential isn't a place that we want them to be. And if you actually think about that through the eyes of a child, a young person, being in a residential setting at 15 with different carers, you know, and in a home that isn't a family home, it is not a good place to be, really. So from my perspective, from a practice point of view, not necessarily always from a financial point of view, it's not really what I would want for our children and young people in Blackpool.
I'm not sure that's, not to be unkind, but I'm not sure that's the answer to my question, really, because I'm kind of and I accept what you're saying, but it's just about value. I know we don't want our young people in care, and I'm completely in agreement with that. But meanwhile, this is a huge amount of our annual spend, so it needs to be spent well. So I'm just looking at, are we really looking at how we're spending that, how well we're spending that, and if there are areas where we can tighten up, and that is all. Really, that's all.
Can I just jump in? I think we're looking at slightly two different elements here. Vicky's talking about value for money would be whether the outcomes are being delivered that we would seek in terms of the spend. In terms of, I think the question you're asking there, Councillor Burdess, relates to, given that we have a young person placed in a residential care home, whether we would rather they would be in a foster placement, then we do have a team who take any matching that needs to happen and make sure that we get the best placement we possibly can at the best price we can possibly get it. So that's within Kate Aldridge's team. They take the matching which comes from the social workers and then look at what availability there is, and then they will challenge the provider to see whether whether the price is appropriate and whether there's alternatives in the market. So they try to manage the market and also challenge the price that's being charged for the placement that we need to use, even though in true best value terms, the best value would be to have skilled foster carers who can manage with more complex behaviours with support from appropriate professionals, maybe mental health professionals, maybe with some therapeutic work which could take place in a more respite setting. So we do have the two things separate, yeah. And so within the team, within Kate's team, they do very much focus on making sure we get the best deal on the provision we have to use, as well as consider what else there is in the market. The challenge can be, if you have a particularly complex set of needs, there may not be very many options in the market. That's where you lead to that place where you end up with being over a barrel that you need to find somewhere that's appropriate and secure and safe, but you don't have a lot of options to play with. And unfortunately, some of the providers in the market are not what you might call altruistic.
Thank you, Councillor Burdess. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Vicky. I believe there are no further questions on this part of the report. On to 1C. Council's wholly owned companies are no longer financially viable. Chief, is this one that you would like to take us through, or which Chief Officer wants to guide us through this part of the report? Oh, it's Steve. Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Steve.
Just make one last point on that last item, that the competition and markets authority are looking at children's social care provision nationally. This is a former Monopolies and Mergers Commission, so it's a national issue. Anyway, moving on to the companies. Recognised very early last year during the pandemic that the financial performance of the companies, it was all important to the wider council family of financial performance. Those authorities that are failing nationally, are generally associated with a company of sorts, and you only have to look at the press, at the headline figures, and the item later on talks about capitalisation directives for some authorities, all linked with companies. For example, more recently, Luton and the airport, where it's stated in the press that their external auditors have advised them to sell their airport. So very early last year, month 2, we ensured that we consolidated the company's financial performances in a consistent basis to understand the impact overall, because of course the council as the parent company were underwriting that, and thankfully we already had a good, strong, robust financial governance framework in place with quarterly financial planning meetings with all the MDs and financial directors, with informal meetings, with a shareholder advisory board here within the council, and of course only this very Monday the executive approved the establishment of a shareholder committee that's going to strengthen that financial governance even more in this area and actually oversee individual companies' financial performance monitoring. So we have in place a very, very strong position in terms of reporting that's consistent, that doesn't require them to reinvent their own financial monitoring, that what they present to their respective boards is what we receive here within the council. And if you recall, very early last year, because there was so much uncertainty in the system, we were looking at losses of anything between 12 and 18 million pounds, because we didn't know when lockdown would be relaxed. We didn't know if and when government policy would change. We didn't know whether the government would support some of these companies. In the case of Blackpool Transport, for instance, received significant funding from Department for Transport. In the case of Beckle, received significant funding from Department of Culture, Media and Sport last year. So very, very welcome indeed. And that figure of 12 to 18 ended the year at 3.5 million pounds. The latest figure for this year is 5.4. And the reason for that is we're not anticipating the same level of central government funding, but we do hope that once lockdown is eased, that those companies will bounce back. And going back to Councillor Hunter's earlier question, will the additional 4-week extension make a difference? It probably will in some cases. We may see that 5.4 million rise, but I would hope it would rise slightly, but bounce back for sure later on this year, if not next. And the indications are so far that with the great weather that we've been having, the barometer that we have of car parking income seems to indicate that the Blackpool really is bouncing back. And in terms of what would happen if the companies are no longer viable? Well, I think we've got the mechanism in place to present those red alerts should that be the case. We provided the cash flow loan facility should they need to, and some of the companies have drawn against that. We set aside a facility of 24 million. I think we've had drawdowns of about half of that. And at competitive interest rates, so certainly not punitive. So we're giving the companies every chance. We've set a deadline of 5 years for a recovery period. I think if companies started going beyond that to break even, we would raise some questions around the viability. But from the information and evidence that we've seen so far, we're not seeing that at all. And I hark back to what I said earlier about Luton Airport. We've got an airport there that doesn't have such levels of scheduled flights. We've got very stable contracts in there supporting the gas rigs in the Irish Sea, which have continued. So in a much far stronger position, albeit on a much smaller scale.
Can I bring in Councillor Hunter?
Well, actually, Steve, I mean, you started to address a couple of questions that I did ask earlier about 2 items earlier. particular point, we don't know whether there will be even further extensions to this lockdown, which is due to end on the 19th of July. But I am assured that you have taken that into account. I won't ask the same question again that I was moving on to. That was really the extent to which the various council-owned companies are in debt to the council. And hope that this never happened. If one of our or any what sort of a hole would that leave in the council's budget? Or are they sufficiently structured that if they did fail, we would know well in advance? Before the situation, council could be financially embarrassed by not receiving money it had previously loaned to the companies.
Did you get that, Steve?
No, I didn't.
Councillor Hunter now.
I'm hovering right over it. Can you hear me now? Yes. Sorry, Steve. I'll cut to the quick, really. Several of our wholly owned companies have borrowed money from the council at different stages and that. If any of our companies, for whatever reason, were to fail and fail badly, what sort of a hole would that leave in the council's finances should that money not be recoverable? I do appreciate the good management and observation of the situation. That shouldn't really happen. The situation shouldn't happen where one of them failed and they had insufficient assets whereby the money could be repaid to the council. But you never know, it could just happen. So yeah, just give us a summary of how you see that situation. Anytime.
£12 million. So at the moment, it would be that level of exposure across the board. 12 million. Yeah. And of course, you talk about assets, but if you have a fire sale of assets, it's certainly not the time to be doing that. But we know our companies inside out. We do our own due diligence, working with them. So we do have every confidence in their recovery plans. But as you say, there may be circumstances outside our control, their control, and that's why we're monitoring on a daily, weekly, monthly basis.
The question needed to be asked.
No, very good question, Councillor Hunter. Thank you. The public interest reports from the fallout at Croydon and Nottingham talked about corporate blindness and institutional blindness in terms of decision making and reporting. Obviously, the fact this item is now on the audit committee's radar as a regular beast suggests that we aren't in that place. But can you assure the committee that that isn't a charge that could be levelled at Blackpool Council?
Demonstrated transparency throughout the pandemic and prior to that, for sure. And we're not averse to as just indicated to Councillor Hunter, to relaying what our exposure to risk is and understanding that risk and managing that risk.
Both in terms of governance and risk management, that charge could never be placed at our door.
Yes, and we try to mirror the robust governance arrangements that we have within the council, within our own companies, and Mr. Towers is ensuring that as a company secretary.
Did I hear your voice?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to sort of build on what Steve was just saying then, that over the last 12 months, the other sub-risk within this area is to ensure that one of the outcomes is that there is robust governance arrangements, and learning from others where they've gone wrong is obviously a key part of that. So Nottingham, for example, didn't invest in their directors and train them and make sure that they were doing their job in a robust way. So all the companies that we have now obviously are recruited. The independent non-execs are recruited separately on a competence basis. There are appraisals in place for all the non-execs across the companies, and those that are subject to recovery plans, we've had separate briefings around their role in ensuring that that their responsibilities around the recovery plans that they've agreed with the council, and their role with that to make sure that they are deliverable, as Steve was saying. So again, learning from others and strengthening governance has been a key part of this last 12 months, and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, and thank you, Steve. That was the assurance that we were seeking as a committee. Thank you. So moving on to 1D, Council fails to reduce carbon emissions and proactively takes action to address the climate emergency. Anthony, I've not seen you for a long time. It's lovely to see you. Firstly, hope you're well. And I believe this is your space. So we sadly don't have much time. If you could provide us a brief update, and then we can go to questions.
Good to see you also, and I'm delighted to be talking about this issue, which I think if we had a planetary strategic risk register, it would be right up there with COVID in terms of need to decarbonise. I think from a council point of view, over the last 6 to 9 months, we've begun to make real meaningful progress on delivery against agenda. And despite having all the pressures of pandemic emergency response, we've been able to carve out dedicated full-time officer capacity to work on this agenda, and we're hoping to add to that in the very near future. And the progress that we've made is also being supported by regular meetings with scrutiny, which has been a good feature of how we've made progress in such a short space of time. And one of the things I'd like to do is highlight some of the real pots of money and resource that we've won to begin to deliver on this. And I'm going to do that, if I may, Chair, very briefly under 4 headings. And those 4 headings map to the work stream that I highlighted in the risk register itself. So we've begun to do real things now, and also plan for future things around emissions reduction. So as a council, we switched to green electricity last year, and we're now working on the much more challenging area about how we look to switch from fossil gas, but before 2030. We have started preparations for an electrical vehicle strategy and infrastructure for the town. It's going to be a major challenge for Blackpool, as it is for many areas, but we've commenced work on that. And a really exciting area in the area of transport in terms of carbon reduction is we're working very closely with Blackpool Transport Services on a major bid for government funding that's just about to open to electrify our bus fleet for the town. An area where we've made real progress in terms of money is housing. So we've won over £1 million of European regional development funding to install green measures in Grange Park, including the new council homes we're about to build there. And I'm also pleased to say that we've now won a multi-million-pound award both this year and next for further green measures in terms of private housing and private rented housing. And we're starting to organise to market that and deliver that later this year. A big piece of work that we've done that some members will be aware of is we've commissioned the Carbon Trust to help us map all the emissions in the town, but equally importantly, what specific actions between now and 2030 and beyond we will need to take to bring us into to net zero, with 2030 being the target. And we're working very closely with Lancashire County Council on those measures also, in particular Lancashire's capacity as a whole to generate renewable energy. We have some of that capacity in Blackpool, but much of it will be found elsewhere in the county. The second theme is around engagement. We've held a citizens' assembly, really positive exercise, including also a young person's assembly that's helping us frame, alongside that Carbon Trust work, our action plan for the town to net zero that we intend to publish in the autumn of this year. We've also conducted a resident survey around this. We have over 100 residents linked in and signed up to our mailing list around the climate emergency. And we are hoping to hold, in fact, we're going to hold the first informal meeting of our Climate Action Partnership in August this year. Third theme, concerns the organisation and our culture and capacity. We found it, despite winning some money to recruit more officers, we found it extremely hard to recruit. It's not the only area that we have that issue as local authority. But I'm pleased to say that we've approved a different approach, that we're going to be going out to advert in the coming weeks for hopefully a number of bright graduate officers with environmental science backgrounds to add to our corporate capacity in this area. So the intention is that we go from 1 or 2 people working full-time on this to 5 or 6 within the next 3 to 4 months. And we're also looking now at options on training staff in carbon literacy and carbon reduction right across the organisation. And then the final thing that I'll mention, I'm conscious of time, concerns working with influencing others. We've made good progress in a short amount of time, but we've already taken what we've done so far into a number of national audiences. And Scott Butterfield, who some of you will know, has presented twice to national audiences on the work that we've done in Blackpool, recognising that we're all learning as we go with this in local governments. And I think particularly important to mention again is the work with our neighbouring councils, both Fylde and Wyre, but also the county council. Lancashire has unique opportunities to capture carbon, but also generate renewable energy and actually make the climate emergency a source of economic growth, not for the county. And we've co-commissioned 4 pieces of work with Lancashire County Council, Blackburn, Madarwen and the districts that are looking at all of that, with the first report coming to us in the
in a small amount of time. Well done. Excellent summary. You've not lost any of your magic. Brilliant. So have we got any questions? Councillor Burdess.
Last question, and it's a nice one, I suppose, really, because I'm right behind this and I'm so impressed with the progress that's been made here. And my concern is if we are successful in implementing all these kind of recommendations, all these actions, and we become almost the victim of our own success, have we modelled these unintended consequences, say for example, for our the companies that the wholly owned subsidiaries, if we're going to cause them problems, and what the potential impact would be, what the potential consequences could be of us getting it completely right?
Thank you, Councillor Burdess. That's a great question. I think if I perhaps wind this out a little bit, I think some people are understandably perhaps a bit frightened about the move towards zero carbon, because they can perhaps see, will this curtail economic activity? Will this result potentially in distress and jobs being lost? The bulk of research that I have read indicates the opposite, actually, that the transition to zero carbon, both traditional and also future activity, will be employment generating. Now, in terms of modelling scenarios, I referenced earlier the work that we've commissioned with the Carbon Trust to identify exactly where emissions come from across Blackpool. There's a very similar piece of work being done at the level of Lancashire, and what interventions will be needed to reduce that to net zero by 2030. And I think that work will be crucial in us having what we might call a managed transition of activity. There's no way we want to in any way harm the economic fortunes of Blackpool, but it's about managing that transition, whether it's how we use power, for example, and how people get to the resort, whether that's through fossil fuel combustion burning engines or increasingly electricity charge generated cars. I think for Blackpool, there's real opportunities in that, and it could potentially be a source of growth and not economic harm.
Thank you, Councillor Burris. Councillor Critchley, did you have a question on this area?
Well, I think he's answered a lot of it, really, hasn't he? Mine was really just about barriers, what barriers may you be facing, and you've talked about all the positives and the people that are going to come together and get together, but there must be some barriers out there that you sort of, how can we get around this, or how can we sort this one out? And sorry, can I just ask, or just say that I appreciate, like, we've got tourism here, we've got all the cars coming to this thing. I just hope that our residents don't have to pay for the privilege because I've heard it on the news, you know, that there might be an incentive for Blackpool residents to leave their cars at home, or they might get charged to come into town and things like that. And that sort of rings a few bells in my head. I hope I've got that wrong and that I've never heard that at all and I've made it up, but I don't think I have, because I did. I just would like some extra spec on that, that, you know, that we're not going to be again, because we're already going to start paying for COVID, basically. So we're now going to emissions to lower and everything else. So I suppose it's what barriers are there, but what cost to residents is this going to be as well?
Thank you, Councillor Christie. I caught the first part of that, so if I answer that first, and then you can pick me up on what I haven't referenced. In terms of barriers, I'll pick a few out. I think it's fair to say, not just for Blackpool, but for the whole country, indeed, the globe. This is a huge challenge in terms of decarbonisation, but it's not something we can shirk. We have to get on with it. And I think we already have some of the answers in view, but some answers we're still yet to find. But also the means towards delivering on some of those answers can be challenging. So to give some examples of barriers and challenges, there is definitely an issue of technology. So there's certain things that we can do and we know how to do them, others we can't. So one of them, for example, is around the ability to store energy, store electricity in particular through electric battery charging infrastructure. But in so many of these areas, dramatic progress is being made because for the first time, actually, renewable energy generation was less expensive than fossil generation last year, and that's a fact. Connected to that issue of technology is one of price. So a lot of the technologies around decarbonisation, so for example, air and ground source heat pumps for housing, these are things that I didn't know anything about a year ago, but I do now, are right now very expensive, in the same way that video recorders were very expensive in the 80s. But I think as demand increases, and it is, the cost of these particular types of technologies and interventions will decline and make them more within reach of public intervention through the likes of ourselves, but also individual consumer purchase. And then coming right forward, perhaps to the here and now in terms of the council, one of our biggest challenges is capacity. And I've referenced before, we have dedicated staffing resource on this. We're about to recruit more officers, but you only have to look in the trade press to see that not just every council, so many private organisations are on the hunt for anybody who understands carbon reduction measures. So we're going to take the approach where we grow our own through the coming years, recognising this is going to be a challenge 10, 15, 20 years for us to deliver on across the country and beyond.
Oh, can I just answer the other part of Councillor Critchley's question? Some authorities, particularly big cities like London, obviously have brought in the congestion charge, which is around emissions on cars. Now, Birmingham are looking at it, and some of the other big cities, Manchester's already looked at it. That is not an option that has ever been considered in Blackpool. It's a more appropriate option when you're talking about big urban conurbations. Our model is more about encouraging different behaviour, not punishing negative behaviour in that sense. So that's the reason we've had the massive investment in the tramway. That's the reason why we're also making the investment within Blackpool Transport to provide cleaner public transport and encourage people to use public transport. But it's an encourage model that we have. Anything which is more, I suppose, punitive would be something driven by government policy if necessary. But that is not a policy that exists here. And where it's being considered, it is very much in the areas with the worst air quality and the worst congestion. As I say, the biggest cities in the country.
I don't believe there are any further questions on this item, so we'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the management response to the external auditor's report to those charged with governance. Plan of attack for this one, team. I thought, Steve, if you just want to provide a brief summary, we'll ask Nicola for a response, then go to questions, if that's okay. Steve, do you want to just provide us with a brief summary?
If you remember, Chair, Deloitte's brought the ISA 260 report on the 25th of March. we immediately drafted our responses for the following audit committee on the 29th of April, but due to an oversight on our part, it never got onto the agenda. So I do apologise for that, but it was done at the time. There were 14 recommendations, of which 3 were high. I'll probably just touch on the 3 high ones, and then we can open up questions for all of them, if that's all right. The first one's around the validation and double checking of work. I think that comes down to professional pride, and it's up to me to instill within my colleagues that it is professional to have your work checked and double checked by other people. And that's the right approach. So I think that's a culture change I need to introduce there within finance. The second one was around value for money for children's services. And of course, this was based on an opinion for the period of which the statement of accounts were set, which was 2019-20. It's quite clear from the management response that the feedback from the Children's Commissioner and a report to the Minister for Children and Families that Blackpool has shown significant improvement, but unfortunately it was significant improvement after the 2020 period. So hopefully that will be reflected in the following year's recommendations on the 2021 accounts. And the final high priority was around financial sustainability, which is basically a reiteration of everything we've said under the sustainability item on the strategic risk register.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for that. Nicola, is it okay if I bring you in for your thoughts?
Yes. Yeah, so we've been through the responses. I think they're all really encouraging. So the next step for us, clearly a number of them are annual processes. So we will make sure that we follow those up and just look at the underlying evidence that they've been implemented as part of the 2021 process.
Do we have any questions for Steve or Nicola at all?
Yes.
Councillor Scott?
Is there the long-term debt recovery? Is there an opportunity here to establish a debt profile and target other areas of the Blackpool economy for this to be put to use in? And secondly, are the correct processes and procedures in place to identify the required levels of savings? And do our corporate leadership teams have the capacity to research new ideas to save or invest in their individual directorates?
Quite a few questions for you there, Steve. Steve, did you hear those questions? No.
Yeah.
Incidents? Yeah.
Areas of the Blackpool economy. And secondly,
certainly, yeah, and yeah, we've done some work on that in previous. Obviously, the pandemic will have had an impact on that. We may need to refresh that, but yeah, I could dig that out for sure.
Secondly, are they? Do we have the correct processes and procedures in place to identify the required levels of savings? And do our corporate leadership teams have the capacity to research new ideas to save or invest in their individual directorates?
Did you get that, Steve?
I think for the latter question, I would have to say yes, of course. We do. We do understand our services. We do have the capacity, capability, understanding, comprehension of our services. In terms of allocation of resources, it's a process we go through every year. We're starting actually within the next few weeks, CLT Away Day, where we start looking at the 22-23 budget and the allocation of resources and priorities. And obviously, in the past, we've adopted a sort of priority-led budgeting approach. But of course, it's based on sort of statutory services to start with. But of course, we've got some discretionary services as well that are absolutely key, critical for the town and its economy. But yeah, that process will be underway in the next few weeks.
Just add a little bit to the answer there. In terms of that transformation capacity, part of that exists within Anthony's team. So he has a team which they understand the data that we have across the council very well, so we can target our effort and look at where we're underperforming and where we could perform better. But also the part of his team is around supporting departments to look at new ways of working and also support them around transformation. So when they do have ideas around how things could be done differently, we have an independent team who are able to challenge that and support the delivery of any change. So that team have been working really closely with Vicky around that transformation plan that exists within the medium-term financial plan investment, and that also exists in other parts as well. So that is where we have additional capacity, which we created a number of years ago to ensure that exactly what you've just suggested happens.
That was excellent, and you, Steve, likewise. Question for Nicola, if I may. I believe the accounts haven't been signed off as yet. Could you just give us an update as to why and when they will be signed off?
Following the last committee, there's been a number of discussions between ourselves and the finance team. So I think I'd said at the last committee that we just needed to sort of finalise some of the adjustments. So we've been going through that exercise over the last few weeks. So I believe the accounts now are there. So we don't need to make any further adjustments. So we just need to go through our quality processes, including updating our subsequent events, getting a copy of the representation letter, etc. So there has been just a bit of time spent on that exercise. Our plan currently is we believe that we will sign the accounts and finish those procedures by the 5th of July. So we plan to sign that week. Obviously, we will go for earlier if we can, but that will be the latest that we go. And indeed, we have got a team lined up to start work in the second half of July on the 2021 audit for the new year. So that is in the diary and being planned for.
So that's great news. Good news indeed to finish a long night on. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for that. Are there any further questions for Steve or Nicola on this item at all? No? Okay, brilliant. Moving on to the next one, which is the Audit Committee Action Tracker. This is just for us to note. Tracy, is there anything in there that you wanted to bring to our attention that you thought we should be picking up on, or is worrying you that it hasn't been actioned?
Thank you. On track with the audit tracker. Quite a lot of the items have been covered this evening, and the other items are scheduled in for future meetings. So I think we're covered there.
To your attention, Tracy, was the one on page 51, with data request 25th of March. That's a meeting to be held with Ms. Wright and Mr. Rayner from Deloitte, Mrs. Greenhouse, yourself, the Chair and Vice Chair of the Audit Committee and the Director of Resources, in order to discuss future working relationships going forward. That's, if you could chase that up. Obviously, we're getting close now as regards scoping work and various things, so that could be a good one for us.
Of course, absolutely. The meeting hasn't taken place yet, Chair, but we will get that in the diary in preparation for the new audit starting.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. Excellent. I can't see any questions at all. I'm looking at all different screens. No? Brilliant. Thanks, everyone, for that. So that just concludes us with agenda item 8, date of the next meeting, which I believe will be in the illumination season. So it'll be potentially flashing away behind us when we do the next one. So that's the 30th of September at 6 o'clock. So thank you very much, everyone, for a very long but successful meeting. I really enjoyed it. I believe we've come together on quite a few items, and I look forward to seeing you all soon as a completely real meeting and not a hybrid one. So take care and see you all soon.